Everyone, and welcome to another Balance Your Productivity live session here on Facebook every Wednesday at 4:30 p.m. If you have any questions while I'm going through some of these things, then do pop them in the comments and I will endeavour to get back to or answer them while we're on the session. Otherwise, I can get back to you afterwards. So thank you for watching, and please do share and watch any of the previous videos in the series. And so if you have any comments or questions, you can do so in the comments below and I will get back to you. And as always, if there's anything specific that you would like me to cover in these sessions, or you've got any burning questions about how to make your life easier, more productive, then do just get in touch. So in the next few sessions, I wanted to touch on communication, how we can communicate more effectively in all sorts of situations like giving and receiving feedback, how to be more assertive, and also how to say no to your boss. And it's one of those things that is important to as a skill generally, but also important into how you use your time and how you can make more effective use of it. So, effective communication. So learning how to communicate effectively and how to say what you feel is an important skill, and it's both for good time management and maintaining good relationships with the people that you work with or that you live with. And not being able to communicate can lead to misunderstandings, wasted time, and feelings of overwhelm if you're not able to either tell somebody how you feel or what you're expecting of them. And it's easy to misinterpret what is being said or what you want doing if you're not clear in what you're saying and how you're communicating. And it's easy to make assumptions based on your own perspective, the way you think, your values, without taking into consideration what's going on for the other person or understanding their situation and what might be going on for them at the time. We don't always have good role models on teaching us how to communicate, and we can very much sort of learn how to do it as we go along, and poor communication skills generally can lead to issues, misunderstandings throughout life. So you need to be able to feel comfortable about having some of those difficult conversations to avoid any conflicts or arguments, and also to be clear about what it is that you need or want. Particularly in the age of technology and with emails, text, social media in particular, is now a sort of an accepted means of communication. There is even more chance for confusion and misinterpretation, and it's much more difficult to communicate feelings or what might be going on, or sometimes even humour in an email or in a text or online. I know people use emoticons a lot, but they're not always appropriate in business communications in particular. You also need to know somebody reasonably well to understand whether a comment they've made is either genuine or perhaps they're being sarcastic or insulting, and particular ways of saying things in different sort of groups will have a different language as well. And understanding what that is and how they work is important to have good communication. I've seen many discussions, particularly in things like social media or even in emails, where things are being misinterpreted because it's either being misread by the person who's reading it, or it's being taken out of context, or you don't necessarily understand the dynamics of what's going on and some of the underlying thoughts and feelings of behaviour that are behind it. Something that can be seen as banter between colleagues can seem very rude or insulting to someone who's either not part of that group or not familiar with the people involved. And Facebook in particular is one of those areas where we see that fairly informal way of communication. And I quite often see comments in groups and sort of think, oh, that sounds a bit rude or a bit sharp, but then you realise that those people know each other very well, or they understand what's going on, whereas to an outsider it's going to be interpreted very differently depending on how what they read into it and what's going on for them. Even a simple statement can be interpreted in a number of different ways just by changing the emphasis on a particular word. And using a different tone can also give it a totally different meaning. So you need to be aware of those things when you are communicating. So a few tips with being able to communicate better are around being very clear in the words that you use, and if you're speaking, your tone of voice, and being aware of your body language. Think about the message that you're trying to get across, and also understand whether it's correctly understood by the person who is receiving it. And you sometimes need to actually check in on that they have understood, or you can sense from their reaction whether the message is being received in the right way. If you are writing a letter or using an email, and particularly if it's not about something contentious or it might be something quite complicated, write it, leave it a little while, and then reread it, particularly before you send it, and think about whether it actually says what you intend. Quite often, particularly these days, our fingers can type quicker than we think, or our brain thinks faster than we can actually type. So what you think you've typed may not actually be what you intended. So just from a grammar perspective, it's useful to reread it. But also when you reread something and you've left it for a while, you're reading it as the reader rather than as the person that's written it. So you might then sense, oh, I didn't quite mean to say it that way. So think about how it might read on a second glance, and even read it out aloud to see if it sounds right. Because again, sometimes you can pick up on tone of voice or the words that you're using and find a different way of saying it, or a different word to use. And if it is something either that's important or that's complex or lengthy, then get someone else to read it and see how they might interpret it. Particularly if it's something on either a sort of a contentious issue or something that you need to be very clear about what it is, ask someone else to have a look at it. I quite often get asked to view documents or exchanges between people to see how I'm interpreting it, because it could be very different from how the person is either reading it or how they're writing it. It's going to be useful to get somebody else's perspective. Don't use email or text for discussions where emotion is an important part of the communication, or it's about something that's likely to be emotional. Pick up the phone or arrange for a face-to-face discussion. There's less likelihood of things being misinterpreted if you have those visual cues as well. Even things like video conferencing can help with that, because you can actually see the person. And be careful with how you communicate your feelings. How you feel is entirely up to you and not anyone else. So it's far better to say, I feel, rather than you make me feel, if you're communicating, either talking to somebody or even in an email. And be genuine in what you're saying, and you'll be able to get the message across as long as the person is open to what you're saying. Also, it's important to be honest. There's nothing worse than being told what somebody thinks they want you to hear and then finding out that that's not actually what they wanted or were thinking or were feeling. And that, particularly when it comes to saying no with certain things, people quite often say yes when actually they've got no intention of doing something, or they know they're not going to be able to do it because they feel guilty if they say no. But that's not really fair on either person. You need to be honest in saying, I can't do this, or no, I'm not able to do that, or no, I don't want to do that. And I touched on that in a previous session, which was all around saying no and setting boundaries. And that is where communication is important. It's also not only about speaking, but also about listening, and listening properly, and not just waiting for someone to stop speaking so that you can jump in and say what you want to say, or you're going through that conversation in your head while they're talking and how you're going to respond. Really listen for what somebody is saying, and forget about how you might be feeling, but put yourself in their shoes, particularly if it's around, again, something that's more emotional in context. And remember, on the basis that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, that we should do more listening and less speaking. If you have something that's important or difficult to say, then set aside time to talk when you're not going to be distracted or interrupted, and focus on any facts and what you've observed rather than going into the emotional side of things. And I will talk about giving and receiving feedback in a later session where this sort of comes in and is more important. Think about what needs to happen or what you would like to happen, and be clear in the way that you are communicating that. If you want to make sure that somebody has understood what you've said, then ask them to feed it back to you, or to summarize it, or ask for their reaction. So again, you're less likely to have misunderstandings or things being misinterpreted at a later date, if you've checked in as you go along. Allow time to adjust, or for the person to adjust for something when you're talking or you're having a conversation, rather than just reacting in the heat of the moment. Particularly, again, with if it's something particularly emotional, and try to keep your voice on a level, rather than getting more emotional and raising the emotional generally, because that's not going to help with good communication. People then get very emotionally intense, and the intention or what you want to communicate then goes out the window because they just close themselves down. If you're not sure whether something has been understood, then you need to clarify by asking additional questions. So that's when misunderstandings tend to arise. And also when people are thinking from a different perspective or a different way of looking at things, they may make assumptions about one thing, or if you haven't communicated clearly, you will make an assumption about something which then may turn out not to be correct. And this also relates to when you're delegating work or you're receiving work, you will make an assumption about something unless it has been clearly stated what's needed and what's wanted. So again, that's where if you communicate what you want and what you need effectively, there's less likelihood of misunderstanding or wasted time or not getting something that you wanted or as you wanted. And how we communicate and how we interpret the world around us is very much based on our background and our own beliefs and values. So it may be very different for somebody else. So it's always worth checking in with them and taking that into account when you're communicating with people. If you talk to people around the world, communicate globally with people, again, we have very different ways of thinking and speaking, and very different values. So you need to be aware of that and adjust accordingly. I think one important thing with all of this is it's far better to assume positive intent when you're communicating, rather than taking the negative perspective that they're out to get you or they want something. If you assume positive, then you're more likely to interpret and see what's going on from a positive point of view, and you're less likely to be misinterpreted and misunderstood. So I think it's always helpful as well to give people the benefit of the doubt and make sure your communication is clear and direct. And if things are misinterpreted, then just go back and clarify, and do it in a positive way, and not assuming that they're doing it on purpose or that they've done something wrong. So I hope that is a few useful pointers on effective communication, and I will be addressing more around how you can be more assertive in your communication and giving and receiving feedback, which is another important issue in the next sessions. So if you would like to catch up on the time quiz, you can always check in on that to see how your productivity and your time habits are generally, and book up a free session with me if you would like to. So thank you, Corinda. Hi, Corinda. Thanks for checking in on this. Good to have you here. And anybody else, do get in touch. And until next time, stay productive.